So yes, I'm going to be talking about the Pabajja Sutta. The Pabajja Sutta means, well, it sort of means just simply the going forth, and it refers to the Buddha's going forth. That is to say, the moment when or the time when he left home in order to pursue his spiritual quest, what's spoken of in the text as the noble quest. And many people were doing what he did at that time in ancient India. There seemed to be a large number of people, in fact, just wandering from place to place in pursuit of the truth. They'd all left home, and they were wandering around North India, living off alms. So they'd go on a begging round every day to get food, and then they'd go off somewhere, presumably to eat it. And the vast majority of the people who did this were those who were trying to pursue, find out what was the highest truth. That was their quest. They wanted to know, well, what was the nature of ultimate reality? So it was quite a noble motive for most of them that drove them out of the home life in order to do this. And they were able to do that because there was a very supportive wider community. It was an accepted thing to do. And people were very, very happy to give alms to people who'd done this to help them along their way. It wasn't an issue. And so it was quite a standard thing to do. Of course, it'd be very difficult to do something like that in contemporary Britain, or probably most places in the West. It's probably even difficult now to do it in India or any of those, any country where previously this tradition was recognized and venerated even. So the Buddha was one of those who left home and became a homeless wanderer. And this particular sutta is the earliest account that we have of what he actually did. It's a sutta which appears in a text called the Sutta Nipata, and the Sutta Nipata contains the most ancient material in the entire Pali Canon. If you're not familiar with what the Pali Canon is, that's just simply one particular recension of the Buddha's teaching. But it's the only one that's survived complete in the language in which it was originally compiled. So it's a very important collection for us. And one of the most ancient texts in there is, in fact, the Sutta Nipata. And indeed, it includes the most ancient texts or discourses of the Buddha that we have. So with this particular text, we get very close to what it is the Buddha might actually have said. We can't be sure that it actually tells us exactly what he said, because for many centuries, for a few centuries anyway, Dharma Priya might be able to. No, he won't be. He won't be able to do this. I was going to say he might be able to shed a bit more light on this, but certainly for quite a while, maybe 100, 200, even 300 years, this tradition was an oral tradition. It was never written down originally. It was simply passed on from teacher to disciple, and so on, down through that whole period, until eventually it was committed to writing. So what we're dealing with is an oral tradition, essentially, or what was originally an oral tradition. And how this came about was because the Buddha's cousin, Ananda, who'd been his personal companion for the last 20 years of his life, had a phenomenal memory. And the Buddha would tell Ananda whatever it was that he'd said on any occasion that he's taught, and Ananda would simply remember it. He would remember every detail, apparently, a bit like a modern day recorder. He had that capacity. And so this is how, certainly this is the tradition as to how the Buddha's teaching was was saved, if you like, or was enabled to continue because of Ananda's phenomenal memory. And so at the very beginning of this discourse, the Pabajja Sutta, it's Ananda's voice that we hear, who just simply says, I'm going to tell you about the going forth. And he then says that the Buddha said, first thing the Buddha said was, cramped is this life at home, dusty indeed its sphere, open the going forth. Now these three lines are very, very important, and they're been a huge source of inspiration to me throughout the whole time I've been familiar with this sutta. I studied this text with my own teacher, Sangharakshita, who I'm going to continue to refer to not as Sangharakshita but as Bhante. Bhante is an honorific term for a Buddhist monk, simply means venerable sir. But we used to describe him or call him Bhante as much out of affection as out of respect. And he was my teacher. I knew him very well. We were good friends. Anyway, he gave lots of seminars on different texts covering the whole range of Buddhist tradition. And one of the texts he chose was the great chapter from the Sutta Nipata. And the first sutta in that short chapter was the Pabajja Sutta, which I'm going to be talking about now. So the first lines that really struck me were these three lines. Cramped is this life at home, dusty indeed its sphere, open the going forth. So you've immediately got a contrast between life at home and life as a homeless wanderer. This is what the Buddha had seen. This is what he knew he had to do. He had to go forth from home because it was cramped, it was constricting. It was a very narrow way to live as he perceived it. And he needed the freedom to go forth as many people before him had done and as many people after him continue to do. But there's something else he says about life at home. It's not just cramped. He says, dusty indeed its sphere. So it's dusty. Of course, he means it's literally dusty. And of course, in India, you can imagine that very easily, especially in the hot season when everything dries up. And the wind presumably blows the dust into the house. And even at any other time of year, apart from perhaps the rainy season, places will become dusty. My mother's home would never become dusty. The slightest sign of a dust mote falling on a piece of her precious furniture, it was death the moment it fell. She'd have it wiped off. Personally, I don't bother about that sort of thing. My room is particularly dusty upstairs. That's not because I'm negligent so much as I'm getting kind of old, you may have noticed. I'll be 77 in 2 weeks, so I just don't have the physical energy that I once had. And so I don't keep it as clean as I might have done on one in the past, but that's beside the point. The Buddha's pointing out life at home is dusty. And that's not a very pleasant sort of image, really, is it? But actually, it's saying more than that, because the term which is translated into English as dusty or dust has a double meaning. And so here we've got a sort of pun, really. It's a double meaning in what he's saying. Dust refers to unskillful mental states, particularly the unskillful mental state of desire. And so that's being pointed to as well. If you live at home, it's a life where you're aroused by unskillful mental states. They're stimulated by the kind of environment in which you live. Now, this may not be your experience. I'm just trying to explain the Buddha's insight to what it was, for him at least, as a young nobleman a young aristocrat, really. Sometimes he's described as a prince. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But clearly he was one of the. He's a member of the sort of ruling class, let's say. He had a privileged background, but he used it well. So, having had this experience of life at home being very, very cramped and constricting and limiting, and having this great yearn as well for something different, the yearning for freedom, he saw that the going forth, so-called, is open. It's open. So you just leave home, you wander, you just wander and wander and wander. That's what they used to do, wander from place to place. The wanderers, they were never settled, except perhaps during the course of the rainy season, where they would need some sort of shelter. But for the rest of the year, they wandered from place to place. And this is what the Buddha did. Well, the Buddha to be at this stage, what he did, because at this time he was not yet enlightened. So he goes forth. And he goes forth, he goes forth literally, he goes forth with his body from one place to another. He goes forth from Kapilavastu, which was his hometown, and he wanders until he comes to Rajagaha, which was the capital of the expanding territory of Magadha. And Kapilavastu was part of a sort of confederation of states, really, called Kosala. And these two states, Kosala on the one hand, Magadha on the other, were big rivals in a way. They were both expanding and slowly swallowing up all the other smaller states, until eventually Magadha overran Kosala, and they established, or the emperor who did this established the Magadhan Empire. So that was something of the political backdrop to all of this. But the Buddha, or Prince Siddhartha, as he's called by in the texts, or Siddhartha at least, wandered from Kosala to Magadha. So effectively, he's moving from one country to another. He was moving from a country which had, or an area which had a particular tradition or particular common traditions, into one which would have different traditions, and perhaps even a different language, or at least a different dialect. So that's important. He was moving from one country to another effectively, if we can think in terms of those as being countries, separate countries in the way that we think of that now, separate nation states. It wasn't quite like that. But nonetheless, he's going into an alien environment, let's say, where he wouldn't know anybody, he wouldn't know the people there, he would have no friends. But he went there, and as he was wandering through the streets of Rajagaha, Bimbisara, who was the king of Magadha, apparently standing in his palace, saw the young Siddhartha coming. And he was really struck by him. He was so struck that, he described him, he referred to, for example, his beauty, his majesty. So you don't often describe beggars in those kind of terms. But there's something quite majestic about the Buddha. At once he knew that he was someone with a similar background to his own. It takes an aristocrat to recognize one. So the king recognized someone who was, in a sense, one of his peers. But it was more than that. He was moved because he saw that the Buddha had a certain kind of beauty to him. So he and the Buddha was in the middle of his arms round when the king saw him, and so the king asked two of his attendants to go and follow him and see where he goes. So they do that, and then they come back and report back to the king. And what they say, or what one of them says, is this monk sits at the east of Pandava, great king, a very tiger bull, a lion in hill lair. I like that. A tiger, a lion, a bull. You know, these are really quite fierce animals. You don't mess with any of them, not if you've got any sense. And so it's interesting that he's described in these terms. There's something about him which is, which is a little bit daunting. There's something about his appearance. It's daunting, but it's also appealing, because there's something, you know that you're in the presence of something different. Most people would not be described in those terms, but the young Siddhartha was. And he'd gone to the east of Pandava. Pandava is a kind of hill, not very far from Rajgriha. And he'd gone up that hill. He presumed he'd found a cave or somewhere to settle and to sit down and eat his food. So the monk, the attendant went back, informed the king, and the king decided to go and visit him. So Bimbisara goes to see him, and he addresses, when he steps down from his chariot, goes to see the young Siddhartha. He addresses him in this way. He says, "Tender art thou, and young, a youth in heyday prime." Heyday is means the same as prime, by the way, in case you're wondering what that is. With finely moulded form, like high-born warrior. So again, there's a bit of a contrast here, because he's a warrior and yet he's tender. We don't normally associate warriors with tenderness, but this is how he comes across. He seems to have a combination of all these qualities, or at least this is how it struck the king. And this was the beginning of a lifelong friendship between these two. Bimbisara became one of the Buddha's disciples, but they clearly had a friendship right from the beginning. They just hit it off, as sometimes people do. So tender art thou, and young. Now traditionally, or the more traditional stories say that the Buddha left home when he's 29. But from this description, it certainly looks as if he must have been younger than that. And this is the earliest account that we have. And there's another account which was attributed as being the Buddha's own account of his going forth in a sutta called the Arya-Pariyesana Sutta. But again, he's described as youthful. He's possessed of youth. And interestingly as well, in both of these suttas, there's no reference to the fact that he's left a wife and a son. The only reference in the Arya-Pariyesana Sutta, the other sutta, you don't even get it here at all, but at least in the Arya-Pariyesana Sutta, the Buddha makes reference to his aged and weeping parents. They didn't want him to leave home, of course, but nothing could stop him. He was driven, you could say, by his own spiritual sort of inquisitiveness. He knew he had to do it. So this is at odds with the more traditional account where he's attributed with, as leaving home when he's 29 and leaving behind a wife and a son. So did he have a wife and a son or not? Apparently there's some kind of scholarly dispute about this. I tend to think that probably he didn't. There are good reasons why he may have been given a wife and son by later scholars or later Buddhist disciples, because it made it more. If the Buddha had a wife and he'd produced a son, that would mean that he'd produced an heir, and that was really important in that society. It was your duty as a man to produce an heir, a male heir. So later texts would speak of him having a wife and having produced a son. He may or may not have had a wife and produced a son, but there certainly isn't any reference to it in either of these two suttas, which is interesting. Personally, I like to think that he didn't have a wife or a son, but he just left home at that very tender age, maybe of late teens, 18, 19, something like that. And there were other people of his age who did that sort of thing. Even more recently, in more recent times, I mean, one of Sangharakshita's or Bhante's own, well, not exactly teachers, but one of the Hindu teachers that he encountered when he himself was a homeless wanderer, was a man called Ramana Maharshi. And he sat at the foot of a mountain in a cave from a very young age. I can't remember how young, but it was much younger than 19. I think it might have been 12. It might even have been younger than that. And that was perfectly acceptable in the society of the time, even up until the 20th century. It probably still is in parts of India. So even someone of that age would be maybe moved to go and lead a spiritual life, to go and go in quest of the ultimate truth of things. So perhaps he didn't have a wife and child, perhaps he left home when he was much younger. Certainly by this description it sounds like it. So the other thing that the king mentions is that he says, he refers to his finely moulded form like a high-born warrior. He recognized him as a kshatriya. You're probably aware that there still is this caste system in India. And the kshatriyas, some kshatriyas would say they're the top caste. The Brahmins insist that they're the top caste. And they seem to have gained out. They seem to have won the battle. But the Buddha came from a high caste family. He came from a warrior clan. And so presumably he'd been trained in the martial arts of his time. He was a warrior by training, and he had the look and the feel of a warrior, someone who was capable of standing up for, to defend his territory. So this gives you some idea of the kind of character that perhaps underlay this young man who became the Buddha. And the king wants to know what is his birth. It's always an important question apparently in India. What's your birth? In other words, what's your caste? But although the Buddha, the Bimbisara almost certainly seemed to understand that he was definitely of a high caste and probably from the Kshatriyas. But the Buddha says of himself, or Prince Siddhartha says of himself, I come from a people, I'm a Kshatriyan, I come from a people of wealth and energy in Kosala. And we're kindred of the sun. So there's a certain sort of pride he takes in his heritage. The fact that he has this kind of background. He doesn't feel guilty about it, about being privileged or anything of that sort. That was just his good fortune, let's say. But he left it all behind. It didn't make him happy. He knew that way was not the way to happiness. It was not the way to find out, what is the ultimate nature of things? The accepted way was to leave all that behind and just wander and maybe find a teacher and sit at the foot of your teacher, learn from your teacher. And if you don't sort of accept their teaching, or if you don't think it goes far enough, then you go off and find another one. Until eventually, hopefully, you find out, what is the ultimate nature of things? What is the ultimate truth? So that was the quest that the Buddha was engaged in. But it all started with this going forth, this leaving home, this radical shift in his life. From a life of comparative luxury into a life of, the life of a mendicant. All he would have been a robe or two, maybe a staff, a begging bowl, and very little else at all. Maybe just those things. That's all he would have. So he deliberately reduced himself to a beggar because that seemed to be the way forward. He wanted to leave behind as he puts it himself, as the life of pleasure. Because he knew, or he felt, he intuited, that that was not ultimately going to make him happy, or anyone happy. And so he then engaged in what was called the Noble Quest. I mentioned the Arya Pariyesana Sutta earlier, and that's what that word means, Arya Pariyesana, the Noble Quest. So that was what he was engaged in, and he said, "This is what I'm interested in. I want to go and strive within his mind to find out, well, what was the ultimate nature of things?" And the questions that had sort of moved him on to this, or why he engaged in this so-called noble quest, was because he realized that he was engaged previously in what is called the ignoble quest. He realized that he was in search of or pursuing that which was subject to old age, to sickness, and to death. And he was going to pursue that which was beyond these things, ultimately what we might call the deathless, Nibbana, or Nirvana. So this was the Buddha's quest. And eventually, of course, if you're familiar with Buddhist history, the Buddha gained enlightenment. He found out what was the ultimate truth. We don't know how long that would have taken. The traditional account speaks of him leaving home at 29, gaining enlightenment at 35. But we don't really know when he gained enlightenment, but it certainly would have been several years, and possibly far much longer than the 6 years traditionally attributed to him. But that's a whole other story. What I really want to talk about this evening a bit more is the going forth, the principle of going forth, because that's at the heart of this sutta. Going forth is an important spiritual principle. Now, the Buddha went forth in a particular way, in a particular environment, in particularly supportive conditions. But we can't do that. We can't do that in our society. So what does it mean for us? Is it possible for us to go forth? And if so, in what ways? How do we do it? So at this point, I thought I'd give you the benefit of something of my own experience, and to try and illustrate it a bit more clearly for you, what it might mean. But also just mention what Sangharakshita did, because he went forth when he was 21 years old. He's given a full account of this in his memoirs. And he was 21 coming on 22 at the time that he did this. And he did it rather dramatically. He gave away all his clothes. He burnt all his identification papers. And this is a foreigner living in India at the time. India was already an independent country when he left, when he sort of went forth, as it were. I don't know whether he had a passport or not, whether he just had identification papers, but he destroyed them. He burnt them, as did his companion. And they found some cloth to make the traditional wanderer's robes, which they sort of dyed in some sort of kind of ochre dye. I'm not quite sure how they did this, but anyway. And they wandered for 2 years barefoot around India. How radical is that? Well, I've not done that, obviously. And none of my fellow order members have done that. But in varying degrees, in varying ways, all of us, I would say, have gone forth. And it started for me in a very, very different sort of way. For a start, I didn't know that I was a Buddhist. But I was deeply unhappy, and it happened like this. But first of all, I'm going to digress. I'm going to tell you about a film I saw on Saturday night. I'm sure some of you will have seen it. It's called I'm Still Here. It's a Brazilian film, very, very moving film. Wonderful film, actually. And, there are lots of ways you can look at this film, but the way it struck me was that, because it's set in Brazil in the 70s, the early 70s, when there was a really rather brutal military regime. And that is the backdrop to the story. And it's a true story. It's about a woman who suffered terrible adversity, her and her family. But That's the backdrop. What I find particularly appealing about the film is it stays out of the politics in a way. You know it's a brutal regime. That's all you need to know. The politics don't impinge too much upon the human tragedy that follows. And it's depicted very, very beautifully and very sensitively. And what is particularly remarkable is that this woman, who has quite a large family to look after, of children, mostly young children, also, although some of them are students at this stage, but despite the adversity she experiences, she makes something new of herself. She creates a new life. It doesn't happen all at once, but slowly something emerges, something quite wonderful, I think. And that's why the film is so appealing. Now, I wanted to mention it anyway, just to recommend it to you if you haven't seen it, but there's a strange connection to this for me, which is this. In 1972, the National Film Theatre on the South Bank, it's now called the British Film Institute. It was a much nicer environment in those days, much smaller. They had a festival of films of the so-called South American New Wave, and it included a few Brazilian films. And I saw quite a number of these films. But I didn't particularly look very carefully into what it was I was going to see. And on one occasion, I went to see a Brazilian film. And I didn't know what it was about. I just thought, well, it's a Brazilian film. I think it might have been the first Brazilian film I saw, so I went to see it. I was interested. But it turned out to be a very graphic sort of illustration of methods of torture that the military government of the time were using against dissidents. And after about half an hour, I felt physically sick. And I had to get up and leave. In fact, I felt like vomiting. I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't quite understand why they'd made such a film, to be quite frank. But on the other hand, presumably they were trying to get a message across, but it was a very, very strong one indeed. And I left the cinema and I walked along the South Bank and up onto Hungerford Bridge. And I was walking across the bridge. In those days, there's only one path and one sort of footbridge, and it was right next to the railway track. And I remember pausing halfway across and looking down at the filthy Thames below, wanting to throw myself down in it. Other things had been going on in my life, which had sort of brought about this state of utter despair I suddenly found myself in. But the film really highlighted it for me. I knew I wasn't going to throw myself down, but nonetheless there was an urge within me to do so, because I felt so disgusted by what I'd seen, and the thought that humanity could be so brutal and so harsh. I just felt I wanted to somehow be free of all that myself. Not that I was directly affected by anything so vicious as I'd seen depicted in this film, but it affected me in that sort of way. I think actually it had a very negative impact upon me, but something positive came out of it for me. Because the previous year I'd been in Nepal and did a trek to Mount Everest, the hard way. It was pretty tough. It was the toughest physical endurance I've ever done, actually. I had a trekking companion and we had a Sherpa guide, but we both got pneumonia on the trek, and we stopped in a Buddhist monastery on the way in, a temple really, a sort of a Sherpa temple, which is basically the Sherpas are ethnic Tibetans, so it was like a Tibetan temple. It was a Nyingma temple. And we stopped there on the way into the mountain. We went all the way into base camp because my companion knew one of the climbers of an expedition at that time. And when we came back, when we'd been diagnosed with the pneumonia by the expedition doctor, we stayed in this temple again, and we shared the room of a monk with him. It was a tiny room. I mean, there was only just enough space for all three of us to sleep on the floor. That is to say, myself, my companion, and the monk. Our guide went off somewhere else to spend the night. I don't know where. Anyway, I was so struck by this man because he clearly had something that I lacked. He seemed so at peace with himself, so at peace with the world, incredibly kind and generous, didn't speak a word of English, but he was so kind to us. And when I was looking down from that bridge to the filthy Thames slithering away beneath me, that image returned to me. It came back very strongly. And I knew then that I had to do something about this. I tried to give up my career twice. I used to be an actor. And I'd failed. But I'd failed because I couldn't find an alternative. But eventually, I found a Buddhist meditation teacher who just happened to be Sangharakshita, who was teaching in Archway at that time. And that was, I think that for me was the turning point, which for me effectively was my going forth. I wanted to leave the world I was involved in behind me completely. And that's what I did. My life has been radically different ever since. In fact, I've been ordained now for over 51 years. I've been practicing meditation for almost 53 years. And it's been my whole life. But that was the beginning for me. That was my going forth. But what about other people? What about you today? What can you do? It was something I felt. I felt an urge to do. I don't know quite what it was that was driving me. But I knew, but something within me was. And I suppose I think or I believe that very likely there is something of that sort hidden, buried within all of us. Maybe we find that our lives aren't particularly satisfactory. Maybe we encounter a lot of suffering and a lot of pain. Most people do. There are very few people, who I meet at least, who seem to be genuinely happy, or at least happy all the time. Most of us encounter suffering in some form or other. If it's not our own, it will be those of others who are near and dear to us, and so on. And you may find that the work you do doesn't really satisfy you, that you don't really enjoy it. You have to do it because you've got to earn a living. But nonetheless, for many people, the work they do does not satisfy them. And so we need an alternative way of living. But that means you need to have to change your life. You may need, for example, to change your means of livelihood. That may not be an easy thing to do. You may not even want to do it. Many people don't. And you don't necessarily have to go that far. But if you really want to pursue the noble quest, somehow we need to make some radical changes in our lives. At the very least, we need to start meditating regularly, making some effort to improve our own mental states, making some effort to lead a more ethical life, and so on. All of these things are important. But how you may or may not go forth, in what way you may or may not go forth, I mean, you may, of course, you've got to feel the urge to do something like this in the first place, but that's for you to find out. But the best way you can do that is by coming here, by going on retreat from time to time, and just seeing what happens, seeing where it leads you. Effectively, that's all I did. When I first started practicing meditation, when I first got to know Sangharakshita, I certainly didn't imagine for one moment that I would end up spending the whole of my life doing what I've actually done. I knew I wanted to get out of the world of acting, and I managed to succeed in that. But if I could have imagined at the very beginning where I'd be 5 years later, I probably would have been horrified. But it worked out good. And here I am today, at almost 77, teaching you about the going forth. So I think that's all I want to say, but I hope that we've got any time. We've got a little bit of time left. Not much, but a little bit. I hope that's been sufficient to stimulate some questions from you. Doesn't look like we'll have very many, assuming you've got any, but if you do have any, just fire away. Yep.
What happened 5 years later?
Let me think. That would have been 1977. I was running a centre in Norwich. I set up a centre in Norwich in 1976, I think. I didn't have any money. Well, I had a few savings from my nefarious earnings. I did a beer advert. Not when I was a Buddhist, just before I met Sangharakshita. It's actually directed by Ridley Scott. He wasn't well known then. He's just doing commercials. Anyway, made me a lot of money. I considered it to be my blood money, so I had to turn it to good use, which I did. So that's what happened 5 years later. Yeah.
What were some of the biggest obstacles that you encountered personally in going forth, and how did you overcome them?
I don't know. All I knew was I felt a strong urge to change my life in some way. I just hadn't a clue. And it was only by meeting Bhante that I was given another direction. And he very gently sort of guided me, really. I mean, when I told him I wanted to leave my profession behind, he just said, "But why?" He certainly didn't encourage me. He couldn't see why that wouldn't be necessary. But once I explained to him what I had to do, he could understand why. But I think one of the biggest obstacles is if you give up your career, as I gave up mine, what else do you do? It's fear, really. And every human being, it seems, has craves security of one sort or another, especially nowadays, financial security. But you leave all that behind. Well, what does the future hold for you? So what held me back? I think once I got started, there was no stopping me. It got easier and easier. It wasn't always easy, though. I mean, when I was 64, I sort of had to go forth again in a different way. Just one of the things I should have mentioned, you don't just go forth once, it's something you have to do time and time and time again. And at the age of 64, I no longer had any major responsibilities within this movement, and there was my community was dissolving in order to set up another community, which is now called Adhisthana, and I wasn't going to be part of that. I still wanted to be part of a community. I couldn't find one to move into. We used to have lots of communities, but many of them just sort of disappeared over time. And so for 2.5 years, I was a homeless wanderer. Kind of. Well, I was wandering from place to place within our movement as it happened. I spent a lot of time in India. I spent quite a bit of time in Melbourne, where I used to be the president of the Melbourne Buddhist Centre. And Singapore, where I've done a lot of teaching. We don't have a centre there, by the way, but that was just something on the side, as it were. And the other place I spent time in was in Spain, in our ordination retreat centre. I always used to go there for solitary retreats, still do. I'll be going on another one at the end of April. But that's what happened then. So at the age of 64, I had no security. I had nowhere to store all my possessions, the possessions that I built up over 20 or 30 years. I had to give most of them away. So that was another going forth. And the moment I left that community, I was blissed out. I was so happy. I couldn't believe it. Strange things happen in life. This might have to be the last question.
Once you started to change your life, did your relationship with family and friends change?
Yes. My parents never wanted me to become an actor in the first place. But once they saw me on the telly, that changed things. Now I told them, I'm giving it all up. They couldn't understand it. They never could. They were never reconciled to it. I mean, my parents, my origins, I have to say, are rather humble. I come from a northeastern working class family, and they had no way of understanding what I was doing with my life, even when I wanted to become an actor. So it was nothing new, but I don't think either of my parents were ever reconciled to what I've done with my life. There's not much I could do about that. I felt the urge to live the way I needed to live. At least my mother understood that I needed to lead my own life. I think it was more difficult for my father. Friends, I mean, most of my theatre friends, because I work mostly in theatre, we just drifted apart from each other because we had less. I found I had less and less in common with them, and they sensed the same. And it's not how I would have liked it to be, but it's just what happened. What happened to me. That doesn't necessarily have to happen, by the way, but it's what happened to me. And many of my friends, many of my order member friends, for example, have got very, very good relationships with their parents who are not at all upset about what they've done with their lives, and in fact are even interested. But it would have been impossible for me to interest my parents, I'm afraid. I didn't have any brothers or sisters, so there's no problem there. I've got no relatives at all now. I'm a total orphan. I haven't been for a long time. But so I have no family. Family's all gone. They're all dead. On that delightful note, I think we'd better call it a day.